Start. Good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the third plenary talk at YLMP 2018, and a great honour to introduce Professor Gary Massey. Gary Massey is the director of the Institute of Translation and Interpreting and a professor in Translation Studies at Zurich University of Applied Sciences in Switzerland. His research interests include, among others, ergonomics of professional translation, translator-computer interaction, as well as other organizational and socio-technical issues in translation studies from the point of view of cognition and translator competence. Professor Massey is a member of many translation studies networks, including European Society for Translation Studies and Thematic Network on Empirical and Experimental Research in Translation. He has published extensively on topics including workplace research, translation didactics, and information literacy. Professor Massey is also a reviewer for numerous publishers and journals, such as Target, Translation and Interpreting Studies, Journal of Writing Research, and Routledge. Today, Professor Massey will deliver a talk on exploring the processes and practices of translation in the workplace. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. As you've seen, I wear many, many heads. I don't have any big head this morning because I didn't actually go to the party last night. I hope none of you have a big head either. I'm very, very pleased to be here. It's a very new experience not to be in Poland. I've been to many places there, but to be in Poznań. And I'd like to thank the organisers for an excellent event and for the great kindness and the superb hospitality I and I think all of us have experienced here, so thank you very much indeed for that. It's a first to be in Poznań. It's a first to be talking on a Sunday morning. I've never done that before. Normally on Sunday mornings I do what I think many other people do, which is sleep. But 10 o'clock is a very humane time to start, I think. I wear many heads. My father once said that if my head hadn't been screwed on, I would have forgotten it long ago. I'm a very distracted type of person, but wearing many heads means I have various perspectives on things. And one of my heads is a head as a teacher. Another head is that of a researcher. The third head, which is perhaps the one that dominates my life at the moment, is that of an institutional leader. Now, that means that a lot of what I do, a lot of what we do, is governed by our strategic mandate. And I'd like to start, because I think it's very important to understand where speakers are coming from, what context they're coming from, and why they're adopting a certain perspective. I'd like to start with a few points about where I'm going, where I come from, and what I'd like to do. You're linguists. You're not all necessarily translation scholars, but you're linguists. But I think to understand where we're coming from as translation studies scholars, you have to understand a little bit about the way in which translation works and the way in which we view translation. I'll frame this talk, therefore, within my institutional context and how we operationalise really our strategic mandate that we have, which is to serve the community, to serve industry, and to serve the society that pays our wages, basically. That's very important for the type of research we do and the type of outcomes we're expected to deliver. So I'll be talking a little bit about definitions, prototypes, and our initiatives at the beginning. I'd like to go on then to talk a little bit about translation in its particular setting. Translation is often viewed as a cognitive act, but people often forget that that act will always take place within a broader event, within a broader context. And within that context, you have a number of interactions with people and with technologies, and of course nowadays, given the realities of many workplaces, but translation in particular, you have a particular impact of technology on the way People are using language and working with language. That's why we go out into the workplace. That's why we do workplace research. We go out into industry. We go out into the particular context in which we are supposed to work. And I'd like to present some frameworks and some methods there. Some of the advantages, some of the potential you have from workplace research, because this is not just about translation, this is about any type of adaptive cognitive activity to do with language. You can explore the workplace, because let's face it, the workplace is the situation in which people perform linguistically. I'd also like to look at the challenges, because it's not easy. It's not easy to do this type of work. It's very rewarding, but it's not easy. I'd like to then take a couple of examples, or one example, from one of our research projects on ergonomics, looking at the ergonomics of translation in the workplace, just to show what you can get out of it and how the feedback loops with industry work. And finally, I'd like to put everything in what we call a transdisciplinary framework. Transdisciplinary is an often misunderstood word, often seen as a synonym with multidisciplinary or synonym for interdisciplinary. We understand it because of our strategic mandate in a completely different way. And I think it's worth exploring that. And I'm going to give you a small framework to work with there. Let's start with the school I am in. I run an institute within a school of applied linguistics. Now this is an important thing to say, because we don't do linguistic research for its own sake. And what is applied linguistics? Well, there are many, many definitions, as there are of any other school of thought or discipline. But applied linguistics, when it's conceived of as a discipline, is surprisingly interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary in nature. Classic definitions are practice-driven discipline that addresses language-based problems in real-world contexts. Another one by Struvens talks about the fact that actually it's almost, he talks of it in terms of a technology, uses this metaphor, I find it very interesting. A technology, he says, that mediates between theory and practice and is applicable to the real world. And if you take just a handbook, I just took this second edition of the Oxford Handbook of Applied Linguistics back in 2010, there are no doubt many more handbooks and many more versions, but just leafing through the pages of that, you will see what an enormous breadth of subjects applied linguistics is supposed to cover. So that basically the nexus of the thing is applying language-based problems to real-world contexts and solving those problems for communities, for societies. In this case, we have language performance, language learning, multilingualism, language policy, again, the societal aspect really, or the organisational aspect, and of course translation studies is there. Do you remember this from your lessons in your various instructions in or courses in linguistics back in the BA? Prototype semantics. The idea is that we think of the world in terms of prototypes. We extract meaning in terms of prototypes, and Aitchison comes up with this very, very clear imagery. We've got the when we think of the word bird or birdiness, as she put it, the concept of being a bird. And research shows that I've got to go back to this. Research shows basically that certainly within European, North American context, you've got the robin here. That's a common archetype of birdiness. But when we talk about birds and think of what the essential qualities of being a bird is, we don't necessarily think about an ostrich or about a penguin. The idea being that we conceive of the world in terms of prototypes. And, well, what's that got to do with what I'm talking about? Well, translation studies people think of the world in terms of prototypes. They think of translation and interpreting at the centre of their universe, as I do. But what I'm talking about is not just translation and interpreting in its professional and very narrow sense. I'm talking about a broad range of language mediation that I think is applicable to all of your realities, all of your linguistic research, because these are the subjects actually that my institute offers. We offer translation and interpreting, but we teach people to edit texts, to do audio-visual translation, to do re-speaking, which is a form of translation for automatic subtitling, or shall we say, instantaneous subtitling, web translation, audio description, the description of films for the unsighted or the partially sighted. Of course, this involves language technologies. We teach multimodal communication, accessible communication. We teach social media communication. All of these considered as parts of the broader concept of translating and audience design, recipient design, intralingually, extralingually. We teach plain language for the cognitively impaired or for immigrants. And we teach them to our translation studies people. We teach multilingual communication, technical communication, depending on the specialization they choose, terminology, text editing. As I said, what I'm talking about here isn't just narrowly related to translation, but to the broader concept of mediation in language. Institutionally as well, there are three major projects that we've been involved in that I think I'll draw your attention to. The information is all on the web, you can find out a lot. I mean, you can go to the links, or all you have to do is put ZHAW, CTP, or ZHAW, Ergotrans, or ZHAW Clint. This has nothing to do with Clint Eastwood, by the way, although I think the acronym was inspired by it. But these are three of the projects that we've been involved in, or I've been involved in. The last one I'm less involved in because of administrative duties. The first is process-oriented. We look at the way translators work in the workplace, but also in the lab, at translators, being student translators and advanced or professional experienced translators. We've got cognitive and physical ergonomics of translation, very workplace-based research. We went to the European Parliament, for instance, and analysed the way they were working and gave them some best practice feedback on that. And the current cognitive load in interpreting and translation is a neurological or a neurologically based study on cognitive load, but not because we're interested solely in looking at what interpreters and translators do and the stresses they are put under and the load they're put under. No, this is a proxy for any type of stress, technologized, cognitive adaptive activity. So the reason we got the money for this was because of that, not because of translation. That's a tip, by the way. If ever you want funding for your projects, try to broaden the purview, the perspective. Try to show why it's so relevant to do linguistics for other spheres, for the business world, for the engineers. And then they'll jump on board. So one of the biggest arguments we had here is if we can analyse what interpreters are doing in their booth and the stress factors working to create cognitive dissonance, we can tell you a lot about the way pilots work. Going back to translation, I think it's important to contextualise what I said at the beginning. Translation is both an act and an event, and people either see it as one or the other, but I think we have to see it as one in which, from a perspective where the act is embedded in the particular event. Basically, it is generally accepted, I think, that in translation studies anyway, just like in many areas of language work, the decisions are guided, influenced, and can actually be determined themselves by translator's socio-technical environment and situation, and therefore we come up, I myself and our institute, with a particularly broad concept of what translating is. It's the act of translation, of translating a source document into a target document for a specific audience or audiences, interlingually or intralingually, as part of a socio-technical translation event. It's often visualized in this way. You have the act in the middle. Here, working as a translator, individually, with a text, being affected and influenced and your decisions being determined by the actors and factors with whom you are working and for whom you are working. Anybody familiar with translation will know this. This is an ISO standard, the standard for translation services at the moment governing the certification of language service providers. And this is just by way of illustration. This is the workflow, an illustration of a typical translation workflow within a language service provider. Now, a language service provider can be an individual providing language services, or a company or an agency employing freelancers or whatever. But if we look at this, we see how complex, and I think the workflow actually doesn't, because of its linearity, doesn't quite show the immense complexity of this particular nexus of activity, but certainly it helps to visualize it. It's a workflow involving multiple stages and multiple actors. We have pre-production, technical linguistic project specifications, for instance, being prepared. And after the act of translation, you have a lot of post-production, including, ideally, feedback loops. These are provided by, usually mediated by project managers, or increasingly mediated by project managers who are working through and for agencies or companies who've outsourced their services. So basically, you have feedback loops going around on the outside here, and inside you have multiple stages. And I don't want to go into the details, but I'm just showing you the complexity of what this workflow involves. It's not just sitting down and translating a text with pen and paper. And if we just look at translation per se, we see that it is here, just here. Translation as an act, it's just there. That's all it is, one particular stage. Translators are classically also involved in checking their own work, which is the second stage. But the rest is outsourced, it's going to someone else, and the translator has to interact with all these people and be aware of all of these stages. By the way, if you want to get certified or accredited by ISO, it's only these stages that you're allowed to leave out. The review or proofreading is not absolutely necessarily done by the LSP itself, it can be outsourced. Now this is also, in many ways, this complexity is also reflected by teaching standards which exist within Europe. I mean, we have a very fortunate situation, I think, in teaching translation and interpreting translation in particular, that there are standards and networks that govern our work. If you're a member of the European Masters of Translation Network, you have to fulfill certain criteria. We are a member, as many translation programs at the master level are. They tell you what to do. They have competence profiles. These are regularly updated. And this is the latest iteration of their competence profile, which has become a competence framework. And I think it's worth looking at, just dwelling on for a second, just to see why we're talking about translation as a socio-technical event involving multiple interactions. Because again, here, our students are supposed to do this. This, by the way, it starts with language and culture. Now, in the older models of translation competence, should we say, this was an integral part of the model. This has now been outsourced, basically, itself. There's very little said about it in the profile itself. Students are just expected to come with this knowledge or acquire this knowledge during their studies, but there are no particular guidelines on precisely what this involves. This is related to language and cultural competence outside, but the main part is, of course, translation. But it's interesting to see that there are new emphases that are developing. Quality control and output quality levels, for instance, become increasingly at the centre of what the translator has to do. Pre-editing, post-editing, which has to do with machine translation applications. You have to pre-edit It's so-called controlled authoring, is inputting machine translation systems with text that the machine can translate well, and post-editing involving the editing of the output. Data ownership and security becomes a very, very important aspect of the world and the life of a translator. In other words, you have to be able to actually ensure that your client has secure data. This is all expected and to be part of the program. Technology, it's always been there, but it's been upvalued with machine translation basics, machine translation appropriacy, should we put when to use it, workflow software and support technologies. These are all things that translation graduates are supposed to know about. But actually the most important thing, I think, from our point of view, because we're talking about interactions with technology, but also interactions with people, is the renewed emphasis, or the increased emphasis, on personal and interpersonal competence and service provision competence. This is just to contextualise what we're doing and showing where we go. Because 15 of these 35 descriptors that we have in this profile are devoted to personal, interpersonal service provision competence, teamwork, collaboration, management, personal and collaborative learning strategies, self-evaluation. In other words, we've got increasingly an emphasis on self-related phenomena, how people perceive themselves, self-efficacy in the workplace. The use of social media responsibly, but also for networking, again, this interactive concept. The ability, though, to critically review language services and policies and to suggest improvement strategies for companies, for services, service providers, and their policies. Now, this, again, taps into another level of what translators are supposed to do. It's interactive and it's advisory. And finally, and this is quite an important addition, be aware of and respond to, there's an and missing there, ergonomic issues. Shape your environment by I'll go into a little bit later about what ergonomics involves from our perspective. But I think this is quite telling. So in other words, we're shifting from pure concentration on language skills and perhaps a few mediation, functionally based mediation skills, to a much broader view of what translation as a language, as a prototypical language profession, will involve. What's the framework in which this is set? Well, basically, we see an increasing shift over the last 20 years or so from a concept of cognition that is based purely on act and processing within the mind, to one that is looking at the way in which cognition is situated in a particular ecology. Hutchins' framework is quite influential, or his theory is quite influential on current trends in translation research, which looks at 4E cognition, basically. It's saying that cognition is not just happening here, cognition is happening in our body, cognition is happening in an embedded situation, it is extended and it is inactive. We learn by doing, we learn, we gain knowledge by doing, we gain knowledge by touching, we gain knowledge within a situation, we gain knowledge and have knowledge elsewhere within our interaction systems. So, to explain this concept of extended cognition, for instance, Clark and Chalmers, back in the 90s already, were talking about the fact that actually human cognition is not just to do with our brains, but it's to do with our physical and social situation. And the important thing to note here is that they're saying that actually cognitive processing is not influenced by external events. It's actually within the linkage between environments, individuals, and their events. That is where cognition is taking place. Hence the modelling that we've seen inside the, with regard to the EMT profile, for instance, which just stands as a proxy for a number of competence models that have been developed over the past few years. Anchoring this, these cognition scientists who have been talking here, and when we anchor it in the reality of the translation studies, we have one particular proponent, I think, who puts it extremely well. Back in 2002, Anna Riskin was saying, translation is done not only by the brain, but also by complex systems. The people, the social and physical environments, and all the cultural artifacts surrounding the translator, or involved with the translator. In a further development of her research, she's gone out into translation agencies and looked at translation managers. She's saying that actually translators reconfigure their cognitive space. They shift part of the cognitive process into their bodily movements, the concept of embodiment here. They interact with artifacts, and the very spatial organisation of their workplace has cognitive effects and is part of their cognition. Technology is obviously one of the biggest factors involved in modern translation, as with any other type of work. And Pim identifies this and put this very nicely. Technology is extended and externalized memory. You know, the word translation memory system, those of you who are not directly involved in the translation industry, must realise that for years, for well over 2.5 decades, translators have been working with so-called translation memory systems. Now, translation memory here is not a metaphor. It is the memory of the translator. It's a storage, parallel databases, storing past translations of individual and organisational translations. Translation is obviously a form of computer-human interaction, therefore. You cannot translate without a computer nowadays, and, as I said, the computer will be holding your memory resources, or many of them. Now, this is just taken from one of our studies, just to show a little bit about the translators' workplaces. By no means as complex as some of the workplaces I've seen. Last week we were visiting Swiss television, where we have a lot of subtitles working. And this is fairly primitive compared to what they've got. They have 3 screens now. They work together with 3 screens, and some of them with 2 separate keyboards, simply because they're keying in at into 2 different systems. But this just suffices to show how technologized our work has become. 2 screens are standard, more or less standard now. It depends on how much you can afford and how much money your company has. But basically, my wife works as a translator at the European Court of Justice. They all have 2 screens. 1 screen for their lookup procedures, and 1 screen for the actual translation memory systems with which they work. So they're constantly switching between the 2. And these screens are big, you know, they're bigger than that, 24, 20, 26-inch screens. I can never see her when I walk into the office. She's always hidden behind these screens. And for those of you who have not worked with these systems, this is typical it's not an actual genuine screenshot, it's a mock-up of a screenshot. Because we had to, this is data, we get a lot of data from the workplace, and of course confidentiality issues are there when we're looking at companies that are translating for Swiss banks. They're not keen on us looking at what they're translating for obvious reasons. Okay, but this is a typical mock-up and of a screen. I mean, it's a translation memory system. Those of you who've never worked with one before or don't know what it involves, you've got basically translation memory works on the basis of parallel corpora, source text, corpora, source language, corpora, target language, corpora. Previous translations will be fed into this, have been fed into the system, and the system. What will happen is your source text will be fed into the system, and the system itself then will continually suggest translations for you as you go through sentence for sentence through this text. It's usually You can set the level of granularity of your translation, but basically it's a sentence level translation. This is a fairly old version of the system, but there are much more modern and better interfaces, but this just shows where we're going when we're looking at the interaction between the computer and the human. And the point is here that the translator is working here. These are the multiple resources around. You've got basically, I think, a concordance button here. You can use certain buttons to search other aspects of the memory. The memory will allow you to do single word searches in various environments. Nowadays, memories are plugged into machine translation systems, which themselves will prompt. And the translation memory system, something like ZHAW, will then indicate to you this is a machine translation prompt, and this comes from the actual memory itself. The reason being that machine translated input is not always quality controlled, and machine translated input obviously is not based on quality secured or quality assured previous translations. Research that has been done on this has shown, though, that translators rarely look at these tags, these meta tags. They rarely look, they don't check, which of course has consequences for the particular quality of their output. There are other issues involved here, which we'll go into in a second. Now, this is, some of you will have seen this before because it comes from one of our cognitive translation process project, where what we did was we basically gathered a lot of data in lab experiments and at the workplace of professional translators, lab experiments with professionals and students, and we got the professionals in to work in our usability lab where we could eye track with their performances and look at what they're doing, and by various translation process research methods try to find out what they were thinking as they were doing their translation. What I want to show with this is what happens when translators work within their normal context, the workplace, and outside of their normal context. As I said, we got professionals to come in from their workplace to actually work in our usability lab. And we had them translate this text. It's the same text that we got all the people involved, the participants in our experiment, to translate. There were a number of other texts used. But the interesting thing here, as you look at it, is that we have an English source text translated into mother tongue German, in this particular case, with a particularly long sentence. Now, we've got the first sentence here is, oh, sorry. How do I, yeah, go back. I'm sorry, there's something wrong with it. Something wrong with my use of the buttons. It's not the buttons themselves. Yeah, got it, okay. The pointer is at the bottom, is it? Okay. The first sentence is quite uncontroversial, 22 words. The second sentence is quite convoluted in 22 words. 38 words in the second sentence, third sentence, 28 words. Okay, so far so good. What we noticed in the lab when they were doing this was that they were actually, especially with the longer sentence, splitting it up quite a lot. Okay? So when they were working without the capitals, they basically, we looked at the number of people who were translating the sentence in one sentence or in two sentences, or splitting it up into two sentences. Now, the first sentence, everybody in the lab without cat tools, in the lab we worked without cat tools, were translating the one sentence with one sentence. That's fine. In the second case, the 28-word sentence at the end, we looked at what they were doing, and basically that was also okay. A few of them were splitting up the sentence, but they basically one sentence. Some people split up the sentence into two sentences. In fact, most of them, but one or two of them left it as one sentence. What we noticed in the lab, though, was all of them were splitting up the long sentence with 38 words into two particular sentences, thus, or perhaps more. Now I've got to work out which button to press. We then looked at what was happening at the workplace, and we just looked at the genuine text that they were using, and we looked at how many 38 sentences. We tried to find 38 word sentences and see what they were doing with the capitals in the workplace when they were confronted with sentences of equal length. And the remarkable thing was that basically half of them at the workplace, whereas when they were left to their own devices without the tool promptings, the tools will probably prompt sentence for sentence translations of a certain length. When they're out of their workplace, they're actually translating more at sentence level, one sentence, rather than splitting that sentence up. The implication being, of course, that the tool, because the way you're working with the tool, is perhaps influencing their decisions. So rather than being perhaps slightly more creative, shall we say, in creating their source text, their target text, they're being influenced by the system which is prompting one-for-one correspondences between the source text and the target text. So this prompted us to have a look at the workplace. This is why we went from our cognitive research to our ergonomic research and looking at workplace environments. And when we're looking at this, we're looking at the way human translators interact with their environments and their socio-technical systems. And interaction means just that. We're looking at the way in which the workplace environment and the socio-technical systems influence or determine decisions by human translators, but also the way in which they can and sometimes do take ownership of their environments and of their systems. It's a two-way process. You can be adapted by machines, but you can adapt machines. Now, the way in which workplace research has been done in the past can be basically, it's a very new phenomenon, but can be basically put down into three areas. First of all, there are cognitive approaches. We've talked about the cognitive ecology theory, the 4E research. This would be the theoretical basis of a lot of the experiments being done, or the, not experiments, but studies being done at the workplace. You have also a tendency, or one area of concentration on sociological approaches based on sociological theoretical designs, actor network theory, practice theory being most recent one. Ergonomics is perhaps the third dimension that we can look at, which is where we were situated. Now, when you do workplace research, and this is information now coming from various workplace deployments of research, you have to be a bit careful. It's very attractive, but it can be problematic. The methods that have been deployed and can be deployed, I think, are fairly obvious, but we'll go through them very quickly. Observational or ethnographic methods, where people go into companies and track and observe, sometimes purely ethnographic in the sense that they are themselves translators within the teams they're looking at. Otherwise pseudo-ethnographic, in terms of just observation, taking field notes. Sometimes people deploy video recordings, so on and so forth. Another method of investigating, which is often coupled with observation, is self-report, the use of surveys, the use of interviews, focus groups, activity logs by the people involved, telling people to do so on and so forth. What we do a lot of is TPR techniques, mixed method approaches. In other words, combining observation, self-report, plus translation process research. Dispositions such as key logging, screen capture, eye tracking, think aloud protocols, retrospective vertical protocols, and so on and so forth. Each of these have their caveats. So if you want to do a design like this, be careful. The first one with observation, you've got the wide code paradox. When you come and look at people doing things, they react differently. They act differently. They do not, they do what you want them to do rather, or what they think you want them to do, rather than doing what they normally do. Self-report has the effect of decontextualization. Obviously, you're not in the context. People are talking about what they do outside of the context. And thirdly, you've got the same effect with TPR techniques, especially when you're looking at unfamiliar tools. If you're doing kind of tests of new tools, it's a bit of a problem. You have to allow for that when you're actually working in the workplace. Two other things that we had problems with were so-called interoperability, the compatibility of what we were trying to use, the software we were using to track, to eye track, for instance, or to screen record, with the software that the companies are using. Lots of issues there. And infrastructure and ambient factors. We were thinking of doing, for instance, think aloud protocols, but then we found out that the company we were going to inspect had just moved to open office spaces. So of course you can't do think aloud there. The advantages, of course, of the workplace research lie in ecological validity, the feedback loops you have with the actual practitioners, the relevance, the transformational relevance of what you're doing, trying to help the stakeholders, and the fact that the research can feed back into your education cycles. You can actually investigate authentic student learning as well, as a kind of addition to authentic workplace research, and you can adjust your educational dispositions accordingly. And you have transferability to similarly technologized adaptive professions, as I've talked about, pilots, for instance. But there are real problems. The challenges are finding the partners. The partners will have agendas, especially if they're funding your research. There will be a self-selection procedure. They don't want to expose themselves to reputational risks, so they will appoint, perhaps, the people who you have to investigate rather than you choosing them yourselves. And the tasking and access, sometimes you will not have access because of certain emergency situations or whatever. The planning is a bit of an issue. Confidentiality, security, consent, anonymity, and reputational risks, these are all very important criteria to think about. Plus the lead times on funding projects. Usually for projects, you get the funding notice a year after you put in the project. By then the technology has changed. Hard luck. Motivating participants. And the other point is that, especially with process research dispositions, when you're looking at competence, actually during the experiments themselves, or during not the experiments, but during the observations themselves, you find that the individuals and the organisation is beginning to learn. So you have to allow for this flow in results. Now when we investigate translation ergonomics, we look at three levels: the physical, the organisational, and the cognitive. Basically, the physical is most obvious to everybody, but the organisational and the cognitive elements, I think, are the ones that perhaps people know least about. And I think it's here that when we're doing our research, I need to explain a couple of things. First of all, organisation is linked into a socio-technical system. So basically, when we look at ergonomics, we look at the way the human being, who's at the centre of our research, interfaces with the workflows, interfaces with the organisational structures, interfaces with policies and processes. The cognitive aspect of ergonomics has to do often with usability issues. How you interact with tools, how you interact with other elements in the system, and how that affects your cognition. The results of our research, well, they're very hands-on. From the physical ergonomics point of view, we did a survey, for instance, as part of our research project. We got responses from 1,850 professionals. We looked at various issues concerning desk height, standing, seating, screen, keying, and mousing issues. That's quite clear that we can do something there. There were consequences for health and well-being, and these would go into our recommendations. Cognitive ergonomics were a bit more complicated, but the issues were often related to communication disturbances, email, disruptive human-computer interactions, computers breaking down, overcrowded screens leading to cognitive overload, responsiveness of computer, things that take 10 seconds instead of 5 seconds, lead to frustrations, distractions, with effects on quality. Email interruptions, as I've said, the quality of source text, and monotony. These were all aspects that we saw as had an effect on the efficiency and the concentration, and ultimately the quality of the workers. And finally, in terms of organisational ergonomics, issues concerning the workflow, time pressure, creativity constraints, such as we've seen in terms of the software actually constraining the creativity of the translators, plus, and this is a very important point, the fact that the workers, the translators, had no way of determining their own fate in terms of the tools that they were using. This has consequences, we've seen, for their self-efficacy, their professional identity, their satisfaction, and ultimately their self-concept, the way they view their own roles as translators. And separate surveys have shown that translators see themselves as members of a low autonomy profession. It's hardly surprising if the technological infrastructure they work within, they have no influence on. So, we have various recommendations. These are very hands-on. And these fed back into the industry. Our industrial partners were very glad about them. It has to do with the individuals. The European Parliament, for instance, adopted guidelines now on ergonomics and have implemented them. And, of course, from our point of view, we feel that this should now be deployed in education. We're beginning to do it in our programs. And we're beginning to offer CPD courses, continuing professional development courses, for institutional translators. And they themselves have instituted their own CPD measures. To end up then, and I'm sorry I've overrun, but I think it's just one more slide. What does this workplace research do for us? And I work back to the institutional level. Well, basically, it is a prime example of what has increasingly become to be called transdisciplinary action research. Now that will focus on real life world problems, integrating various disciplinary paradigms, ergonomics and translation studies, for instance. Participatory, we talk with the people we research. And creating a unity of knowledge beyond the disciplines. What we're doing, of course, is something that hasn't been done before. And we're not the only ones. It involves collaboration of researchers, communities of practice, and the organisations they work for. Scientific knowledge is produced to meet societal knowledge demands. It's not produced for its own sake. And becomes an integral component of problem solving in the life world. And basically the model we've adopted, and the model I think that serves as our framework, is ultimately an action research model. We plan, we act, we observe, and we reflect. We do so for ourselves, but we do so for and with communities of practice, communities of education, and, of course, communities of research. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the lecture. I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you very much for an extremely inspiring talk. I feel a little bit overwhelmed because I'm thinking about our students, our trainees, how to prepare them for this dynamic, changing workplace. Do you have any suggestions? suggestions how it is done in Zurich. When should we expose our students to the real workplace environment?
I think that's a very, very good question. And I must say that we're feeling our way through these answers. We've noticed, this was about workplace research, of course, but I gave a workshop yesterday on using translation process methods in the classroom, or in training. We adopt broadly the same methodology to train our students. We look at processes rather than products, which is the classic way of evaluating translation performance. We look at the way they do, how they do it rather than what they do. And what we noticed through this research is that we have overwhelmed them with too much technology too fast. So for instance, a very clear example, I think a couple of you were there yesterday, we have audiovisual translation courses where from the very word go we get them because we feel that it's good for them to get experience. We give them FAB subtitler, which is the industry standard. And we get them to work with it from week 1 of their AVT courses. By doing the research we've done, process research, on the way in which they're reacting to this in the classroom, by eye-tracking their performance in the classroom, well, in the lab, but with classroom assignments, we saw that they're not looking at the pictures, they're just looking at the technology surrounding it. I don't know if you've seen that kind of subtitling software, but basically you have a bar at the bottom and a spotting list on the side and the image right in the middle, and you overwrite basically the image with your particular translation, subtitling translation. And when we were tracking the eye movements of an entire cohort of people doing AVT, all they were looking at was the lower bar and the sidebar. They weren't looking at the images, which led to multiple mistranslations because they were not able to understand. And if you looked at the images, for instance, one chap was talking about problems that were packed up. And when he said packed up, he moved his hands one above the other. And of course, packed up is not a common idiom to use in this context, so a lot of our students were looking this up and then mistranslated it. They just didn't think to look at the imagery. So too much technology too early is a problem. But we have to prepare them for this reality, so we have to scaffold it. The other thing that I would do is be selective. I think we've come to the point where we cannot teach everybody everything. We have to stream. We're introducing 3 streams now in our program. One is classical translation, which would be the type of translation done up till now, with the tools and with the language competencies, 3 or 4 languages involved. All of our students have to have at least 2 foreign languages. But then we've got translation management. We're introducing that, which is a kind of meta level. They only have to translate in one version, so they get an idea of what translation involves itself, but they're involved with technological systems, machine translation integration, workflows, consultancy services, so on and so forth. That's what we're going to teach. And the third, because we're particularly strong in this, is barrier-free or accessibility communication. In other words, AVT, but deployed specifically for the hard of hearing, the partially sighted, and the cognitively impaired. So these are the 3 strands we've opted on, and my advice would be to do that. Not create new, I mean there are legislative reasons why we cannot create another specialization officially. So what we've done is we've done sub-profiles within the training programs. But I agree with you. I mean, look at the list, these 35 descriptors. How is anybody going to get that? But I would stream according to inclination, and perhaps do a bit of aptitude testing for that at the beginning. And again, I would say process-oriented aptitude testing rather than product-oriented is very good. You know, we do that with all our MA students. We get them to we screen record all of their translations. So we evaluate their products, but also their processes. And there you can see that those who are technologically gifted or not, and who are scared, those who are scared of it. Often when we comment, when we go through it with them, then you'll hear about their preferences, and then we say, look, don't do translation management. Do this.
think? So you have a job with a lot of pressure, with not too much autonomy, maybe less creativity than you hoped for when you started out as a translator. Do you have any information about the career of a translator? How many people do this for 40 years, for instance?
That's a very, very good question. People used to do it for a career, and depending on where what we've found is that there are different attitudes to the job, different motivations for the job according to what type of translator you want to be. You have to realise that translation as a profession covers a multitude of areas, not just domains, but also forms of work. So you have freelancers, you have commercial staff translators, and you have institutional translators. Now the institutional translators, the people who work for the EU, for the Commission, for the Court of Justice, they tend to stay. They will stay or perhaps move up in their own organisation. Once you're in the EU, you'd be a fool to get out of it because you get a job for life, you're an official. I know, my wife is one. So it's excellent job conditions. The same with the Swiss Confederation as a translator, for instance. So they tend to stay put. What we've noticed with our graduates is that they tend to start out as freelancers. If they have the opportunity to become an institutional translator, they'll take it and stay. Otherwise, they will often mix their profile, their freelance profile, with other activities related to language. Teaching is a classic. Of course, and this sounds terribly sexist, and it's not meant to be that way, 90% of our graduates are women. And they do have, many of them will appreciate the ability to work as freelancers for agencies because they can work from home and part-time. So this is another thing. So you'll find them staying there. What we find with the commercial translators is that the burnout rate is higher because the commercial companies really want their money's worth. And Linebridge, for instance, CLS Communication has now joined them. They really have very hard productivity measures. So you're measured in productivity in translation, you're measured on the numbers of standard pages you translate per year. And they can be very hard, depending on what company you work for. So you see a lot of attrition there. What we're finding, though, is that new professions are opening up, sideline professions, because of the advance of machine translation, which is obviously taking a lot of work for the kind of routine type of translation that used to be done by humans away from the humans. Instructions, for instance. We're finding that there's a new area now emerging called transcreation, where what you have is translators with a lot of intercultural knowledge, a lot of linguistic creativity, working together with corporate communication specialists to develop marketing and branding texts and strategies. So you've got this transcreation element. Now this seems to be, I wasn't aware of how important that was until I basically had an MA student have a look at the industry in Switzerland. And in Zurich alone, in the greater Zurich area alone, she found 11 transcreation companies. I didn't know that they existed. So this is an up and coming, I don't know, but I can imagine that 10 years ago there wasn't one transcreation company. So you're beginning to see a shift towards the human value added in translation, and that is our great hope for the future. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you. I think that's all the time that we have for questions. So let us once again thank the speaker.